Early enough in the war in Syria and Iraq, a relatively new phenomenon emerged. Male-dominated jihadi violence attracted women and young girls who themselves offered to play a role in recruitment and, in some cases, the battlefield. Women in combat is not a new phenomenon, and there were volunteers in Turkish forces from around Europe, which were not regarded as terrorist fighters. Since many of the women have been repatriated while others are serving jail time or have faced the death penalty in Iraq, we want to discuss the role of gender in jihadi terrorism, how it compares to other terrorist movements, and how this factor influences both investigation and prosecution in counter-terrorism policy. Are women victims of or agents of jihadi terrorism? Tactics Today talks to Seran de Leede. Ms. de Leede works on the topic of women, gender and political violence as an independent researcher and as an associate fellow for the International Centre for Counter-Terrorism, The Hague. Ms. de Leede, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
So let me begin with the first question about what exactly motivates a woman to become involved in a violent extremist group. And essentially, what are the differences between far-right and jihadi terrorism?
Well, pretty much the same as what drives men to violent extremist groups. Obviously, there's small differences, but when it comes to women, we tend to assume that they are driven by different factors, more personal or emotional factors, and we tend to overlook political or ideological motivations. In part, this has to do with persistent stereotypes on women and violence. But like men, women's behavior is complex and subjected to personal characteristics, social, cultural, and political environment, and their surroundings. So when we look at women supporting Daesh, ISIS, for example, when we look at the drivers for Western women, we see a complex combination of both personal but also ideological motivations. They seek their identity, they look for a purpose, they see it as their religious obligation, they are convinced that there is a war going on against Muslims, against Islam, and they feel it is their obligation to look for a sense of adventure, to rebel against society. There's all these different motivations, and with women also we tend to assume that they are a homogeneous group just based on them being a woman, but obviously that is not the case. Women are a heterogeneous group, so some of these factors may be more relevant for some women than they are for other women, just as what we see with men. They're not driven by the same drivers either. When you compare jihadi groups or women in jihadi groups, or the drivers that women have for supporting jihadi groups with far-right extremism, there is obviously there's the ideological differences, right? That women, as reasons for women supporting such groups. For example, when we look at far-right extremist groups, women can be just as racist, xenophobic as their male counterparts. The need to protect the country that they live in, their nation. This is all very similar between men and women, and obviously that doesn't go for women supporters of jihadi groups because the ideology is different. But aside of these ideological differences, the dynamics are very similar. In both groups, we see that they look for a place to belong, a search of protection, a purpose, but also again adventure, to rebel against society. So these dynamics are very similar between jihadi groups and far-right extremist groups, or at least the motivation for women to support. Interestingly, we also see a rejection of feminism within many of the female supporters in both groups. So in far-right extremist groups, women who reject feminism often see feminism as the cause of moral decay. And in jihadi groups, several women felt that Western feminism offers very little room for Islamic values, so they oppose this form of feminism from that perspective. So yeah, I think, does that answer your question a little bit?
Yes, yes, absolutely. It actually brings me up to my next question. I mean, you say that what actually brings these two, the far right and jihadi terrorism together, is something like they both have a place to be. They want a place to belong, and they are both rejecting feminism. So my question is here, yes, the motivation seems to be similar, and they seem to have similar
these are dynamics,
dynamics, yeah. But so do they have different roles? What are the roles that these women assume in these violent movements, and are they different if they are jihad or far right?
It has a lot to do with space as well for women. Like both groups are highly patriarchal and, at least from our perspective, highly misogynistic as well. So they have very strong ideas about the roles for women in these groups, and mostly they are so different than roles of men. Mostly they are more supportive, more facilitative, rather than operational or in the front lines. But there's differences as well. Like what I meant with space is that when you look, for example, at more ethno-nationalist or left-wing extremist groups, women have far more space to engage in these groups. So that's why you see far more women in front lines in left-wing extremist groups or ethno-nationalist groups, because there's more space for women, which has to do with the ideology. But when we look at far-right extremist or jihadi groups, they have little space, or less anyway, which doesn't mean that women cannot play a role in operational capacities as well, of course. I mean, but in a different way. And when there's differences between the far right and jihadi as well, when you look, for instance, in far right extremist groups, women tend to have more room to organize themselves independently. So there's also female-only militant gangs operative in, for example, streets of Berlin, which is something that you don't see in jihadi groups. On the other hand, in jihadi groups, women can engage as suicide bombers, something that we don't see in far-right extremist groups. Women in far-right extremist groups can be more visible. For instance, when there's demonstrations or protests, women play a more visible role in these demonstrations as well. Whereas in jihadi groups, women are more behind the scenes, which also I think has to do with Purda, so with within jihadi ideology that men and women who are not related cannot mix, which is something that they don't have in the far right. So that's why we see women in demonstrations or raising funds, etc. That is something that women in both groups engage with, and also recruiting others through different ways. I think the internet really plays a facilitative role here for women as well, that creates more space for these women to engage in different matters. Yeah. I mean, and also, of course, I'd almost forget the relevance of motherhood. The relevance of motherhood for within both groups. That is something that is very much important that we see within both groups, that they are protectors of the race or protectors of the jihadis in terms of in the case of jihadi groups, and in terms of far right extremist groups, protectors of the race. And so that's a similar role as well. Yeah.
I mean, there's a common perception that the Europeans that migrated to Syria and Iraq to fight the Islamic State were second generation background. To what extent were they converts? Does a female convert have a particular profile? I mean, you mentioned motherhood. Is there a profile?
No, there's no profile. There's a we've seen young girls aged 13 leaving from Western countries, mothers with their entire families, mothers in their 40s. So there's not really one profile. Also, in terms of socioeconomic backgrounds, there's many differences. So we cannot draw up a workable profile, although that would obviously be very handy if we could, but that's just not the reality. That doesn't mean that there is no, that there's nothing that that stands out. Like you mentioned converts, it's quite remarkable that, at least from that we know from Western European countries, the percentage of converts under female deputies is quite high, around both for Germany as for the Netherlands. It's around 30%, a little bit over 30%. When you compare that to males in the Netherlands, it was around 7%, and in Germany around 17%. So the percentage of women, of converts under women is remarkably higher, also in France and the UK context. To my knowledge, there's no really an explanation for this difference between men and women when we look at converts. Also, women tend to be younger also than men, with an average age of around 20. Let's see. But, and also, at least in the Dutch context, several women came from a broken or troubled family situation, broken families, history of either domestic or sexual abuse. Obviously, that is not, it doesn't have a predictive value. So in that sense, it is not something that we can work with, but it is noteworthy. And I think it is also something that that awareness of this can also help in optimizing intervention or de-radicalization programming. So, but as I said, it's not a workable profile that we have. We have this image, or at least in common conversations, there's often this image, I think also fed by media portrayal of women as jihadi brides, which sort of implies a passivity of women just merely following their husbands, or being manipulated, or they have a crush on this boy that they met online, and that's how they ended up in Syria. And obviously we've seen these cases. I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but the assumption is as merely passive followers, which denies them any agency to raise their hand, to overlook. By framing these women as jihadi brides, we tend to overlook the other stories, I think.
So, and finally, what kind of crimes are these women accused of usually? And does gender affect the prosecution strategy?
When we talk about female returnees to Western European countries, mostly they are charged with membership of a terrorist organization, of terrorist offenses. Membership of a terrorist organization can be, for women at least, more difficult sometimes to prove, as women often take on less visible roles also within the caliphate, like with the men posing with guns or in a brigade or something. Membership, I assume, is more easily to prove than a woman who stays in the house most of the time. There's this German example that I know of, a woman who was convicted for this offense for 3 years. And it was proven that because she accepted the salary of ISIS, she lived in a confiscated, were fighters, convicted of membership of a terrorist organization. In a Dutch case, there was a woman who was sentenced to 2 years, of which 13 months probation for preparation. Increasingly, we also see women getting convicted for war crimes, such as inhumane and degrading treatment of persons. We know of at least some women who were involved in the sex slave trade of the Yazidi women. So if possible, women can be prosecuted for this. Also, increasingly, we see women getting convicted for pillage because of living in confiscated houses, accepting spoils of war, etc. And also for child recruitment into an armed group. There's been women who enlisted their children in the battalions for child soldiers. So women could be charged with this. And also other criminal charges such as parental abduction of minors, but also neglect or endangerment of their children, deprive them of education. So offenses like this. In terms of sentencing, practices, at least worldwide, they vary considerably. In the beginning, in the European or in the Western context, women received far more lenient sentences in terms, on the one hand, because it's more difficult to prove their involvement in a terrorist group, but also because of the assumption of women victimhood, that they were lured there under false pretexts. But this increasingly is starting to change. There's more attention for women's roles or women's diverse roles also in terrorist organizations. So there's more investigations going on, and there's been looking for different ways of prosecution. So that is changing. But also in other states, women tend to be subjected to far harsher sentences, such as life sentences in prison, even death penalty for mere association with Daesh because they lived in the territory. And this really, I think, underscores how gender biases cut both ways. Like, on the one hand, it victimizes women, or even maybe infantilization of women, and on the other hand, the vilification for breaking gender stereotypes. So there's two sides of this coin. So yeah, there's differences in how different states respond to these women. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your time, Ms. De Leede.
You're very welcome. Thank you.